The coffee machine in the break room of Helix Capital made a sound like a small animal in distress every morning at precisely 7:14. And Ethan Carter had learned to time his arrival around it. He came in early, always early, before the rest of the floor filled up, before the glass conference rooms began to glow with the blue light of projectors, before the sound of Ryan Blake's laugh began bouncing off the marble columns near the elevator bank. Ethan liked the stillness of the office before it became the office. He liked the way the Miami skyline looked at that hour, the water in the bay still flat and gray, the light not yet decided about what kind of day it wanted to be. He set his bag down at his desk, third row from the window, not by choice, and opened his laptop. 3 tabs were already running from the night before. He'd fallen asleep at his desk at home around 11, which meant the analysis on the Meridian infrastructure portfolio was only about 60% done. He picked up where he'd left off without thinking about it. This was how he worked. No ceremony. Ethan Carter was 38 years old. He had 3 children: Sophie, age 9, Owen, age 7, and Lily, age 4. Their mother had left when Lily was 14 months old, not violently, not with a dramatic scene, just quietly, efficiently, as if she'd made a business decision and was executing the exit strategy she'd had in a drawer somewhere. Ethan had not contested it. He'd simply absorbed the new reality and reorganized his life around it, the way he reorganized everything. Methodically, without self-pity, one task at a time. He was good at his job. Very good. The kind of good that was invisible to people who didn't know what they were looking at, which, at Helix Capital, included most of the senior leadership. His analyses were clean. His models held up under pressure. Twice in the past year, he'd flagged risk exposures that the firm's automated systems had missed. Both times the flags were acted upon, the losses avoided, and neither time was his name mentioned in the follow-up report. The credit had a way of diffusing upward in organizations like this one, spreading thin over the faces of people who had better suits and louder voices and no children waiting. His colleague, Ryan Blake, for instance, had a voice that carried. He wore his shirts with the cuffs rolled up in a way that suggested controlled casualness, a practiced ease. He knew how to walk into a room. He knew which partners played golf and which ones preferred tennis, and he could talk about either for 20 minutes without once having to think. Ryan Blake's quarterly reports were mediocre and everyone knew it, but when Ryan walked into a room, people turned their heads. When Ethan walked in, they turned back to their phones. Carter. Ryan appeared at the edge of Ethan's desk that Tuesday, 3 weeks before the gala, holding a coffee he hadn't made himself. "You hear about the summer event?" "I heard. You going?" "Probably." Ryan looked at him for a moment, that practiced look, the one that wasn't quite condescension but was its neighbor. "You bringing someone?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He was looking at a number in column F that didn't match column H, and his mind was on the discrepancy rather than the conversation. "I'm bringing Sarah Weston," Ryan continued, not waiting. "Her dad runs the Weston Group out of Boca." "So," he picked up a pen from Ethan's desk, uncapped it, recapped it, set it back down. "Should be a good night." "Should be," Ethan said. Ryan lingered 1 moment longer than necessary. That was his signature move. The extra beat that said, "I have somewhere better to be. I'm just choosing not to go yet," and then walked away. Ethan looked back at his screen. Column F. Column H. The discrepancy was $2.3 million, and it had been hiding in a footnote of a subfund disclosure document since February. He found it at 8:47 inches the morning on a Tuesday, before anyone else had finished their first cup of coffee. He wrote it up, sent it to his manager, and got back to work. He did not think about the gala again until his calendar reminder went off 2 weeks later. The apartment he shared with his 3 children was in Brickell, not the expensive part of Brickell, but the part that was 3 blocks east of expensive, which was close enough to feel the pull of that world without any of its amenities. It was a 2-bedroom. Sophie and Owen shared 1 room. Lily had the small alcove with the window that faced a parking structure. Ethan slept on a fold-out couch that he'd long stopped folding out. The couch, in its closed configuration, was more comfortable than it looked. His evenings were structured by necessity. Pickup at 5:45, dinner by 6:30, homework at the kitchen table from 7 to 8, Lily to bed at 8:15, Owen at 8:45. Sophie, who had recently decided she was too old for a set bedtime, negotiated until 9:30. Then Ethan cleaned the kitchen, checked his email, paid whatever bill was most overdue, and opened his laptop. The laptop was where the other part of his life existed. He'd found the forum by accident, one of those late-night tangents that begins with a search for a specific volatility model and ends somewhere unexpected. The forum was called Asymmetric, and it operated in a kind of deliberate obscurity. No advertising, no recommended posts, no algorithm. Just threads, and the people who found them. He'd posted his first comment 7 months ago. A response to a thread about second-order effects in emerging market debt restructuring. It was a long response, careful, dense, with 3 attached charts he'd built himself. He hadn't expected anyone to engage with it seriously. Atlas One had responded within 4 hours. The response was 3 paragraphs. No pleasantries, no qualifications. Just direct engagement with his argument. A disagreement on one point, a question about another. The question was good, the kind of good that made him sit up straighter. He'd written back. Atlas One had written back. And they had, over the following months, been writing back to each other ever since. They discussed capital allocation. They discussed regulatory architecture and its failures. They debated the ethics of short selling during humanitarian crises, not as an abstract exercise, but with actual positions, actual disagreement, actual risk of being wrong. Atlas One had strong opinions and supported them well. Atlas One also listened. In 8 months, Ethan had never had the experience of making a point and having it ignored. Atlas One either agreed, disputed, or asked for clarification. Nothing disappeared into silence. He did not know who Atlas One was. He had not asked. This was partly habit the forum's culture discouraged personal disclosure, and partly something harder to name. The anonymity felt like the point. For the first time in years, someone was responding to what he said, not to who he appeared to be. Atlas One's messages had a particular quality. They were precise without being cold. They asked the right questions, not the impressive ones. Once, in a thread about institutional risk culture, Atlas One had written, "The real question isn't what systems fail. It's why the people inside them keep pretending they work. What is it that you're pretending works?" Ethan had stared at that message for a long time before answering. There were things about Atlas One that didn't quite add up. The hours were strange sometimes. Messages came in at 4 a.m., sometimes in the middle of a European trading session. The knowledge base was unusually wide. Atlas One could discuss distressed credit in Southeast Asia and then pivot to regulatory frameworks in the EU without missing a beat. Not the knowledge of someone who read a lot, the knowledge of someone who had been inside. Ethan had his theories. He didn't pursue them. What he knew was this. In the landscape of his daily life, the noise, the commute, the children, the office where he was mostly invisible, Atlas One was the one frequency he could tune into cleanly. The event was held on the rooftop of the Meridian Tower, which was the kind of venue that existed to remind you of how far you were from the top of things. 42 floors up, open sky, the whole coastline spread out like something from a dream someone else was having. String lights, champagne in narrow flutes, a jazz quartet working through standards in a way that was both accomplished and completely forgettable. Ethan arrived at 7, 15 inches, a suit that was 2 seasons old but still fit. He had no date. He had taken the elevator up alone, which gave him 2 minutes of silence before the doors opened onto the noise. He stood for a moment at the entrance and took in the room. He recognized most of the faces. Helix Capital Partners, fund managers from competing firms. A few city council members who showed up to these things because it was expected of them. The usual geometry of people who had money and the people trying to get close to people who had money. He got a glass of water from a passing tray he was driving and positioned himself near the outer railing where the view was good and the crowd was thin. You came alone? He turned. A man he vaguely recognized from the capital markets floor, Collins, or Hollins, something like that, was looking at him with an expression that was not quite a smile. I did, Ethan said. Brave. The man said it in a way that did not mean brave. Ethan looked at the bay. A container ship was moving slowly across the horizon, enormous and unhurried, lit up like a small city. Ryan found him 20 minutes later. He materialized with Sarah Weston on his arm, blonde, easy in the room, the kind of ease that comes from a childhood of these kinds of rooms, and two other men Ethan didn't recognize. Carter. Ryan's voice was calibrated for an audience. Didn't see you come in. You here by yourself? Looks that way. Ryan glanced at the men beside him, then back at Ethan, with an expression that seemed to ask the room to appreciate the contrast between them. Man, that's rough. These events are rough, Solo. He clapped Ethan on the shoulder, one beat too long. Sarah. This is Ethan. Sarah smiled graciously. One of the men with Ryan tall, wearing a watch that cost more than Ethan's car, said something in a low voice that made the other laugh. Ethan didn't catch it. He wasn't sure he needed to. There's a spot at the bar, Ryan said, already turning away. You should try the aged rum thing they're doing. Take your mind off things. They moved away. Ethan stood where he was. A woman nearby, someone's wife, someone's associate, he couldn't tell, met his eyes briefly, then looked away. The way you look away from something that makes you feel uncomfortable in a way you don't want to examine. Ethan set his water glass down on the railing. He had a clear-eyed understanding of the situation. He was not what this room was built for. Not because he lacked the intelligence or the record, he had both, but because this room ran on a different currency, and he had never learned to spend it. He did not perform ease. He did not perform belonging. He simply arrived and was, and apparently that was not enough. He picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd left it. He thought about his 3 children asleep at home. He thought about the sitter, Marcus, a graduate student who charged $40 for the evening, and whether he'd left enough cash on the counter. He thought about tomorrow, which would be the same as today, except that he'd have this memory added to it. He turned toward the exit. The elevator bank was on the far side of the roof, past the quartet and the crowd and the champagne. He moved through it without looking at anyone, taking the most direct line, the way you move through a space when you've already decided it doesn't belong to you. He was 10 feet from the elevator when the sound changed. It was the sound of an entrance, not just a door opening, but the particular silence that precedes someone who has learned to make silence work for them. The string quartet hit a rest. The closest conversations dropped in volume. Someone near the elevators made a small, involuntary sound. Ethan stopped. The woman who stepped off the private elevator was not performing anything. That was the first thing that registered, not her appearance, not the dress or the jewelry, but the quality of her stillness. She moved across the rooftop the way water moves. No effort, no announcement, simply the passage from one point to another. People didn't part for her so much as they just happened to be elsewhere when she walked through. Ethan knew the name Victoria Hale. Anyone who followed Global Capital knew the name. She had founded the Hale Group at 29 with a single fund, a rented office in Boston, and a return-to-benchmark ratio that had made people stop arguing with her within 3 years. She was now 41. The Hale Group managed $47 billion across 6 continents. She gave no interviews. She published no quarterly letters. She did not have a profile anywhere. She was looking at him, not scanning the room, and landing on him. Looking directly at him, with the specific intention of someone who knows exactly what they came to find. He didn't move. She crossed the rooftop in a straight line past Ryan Blake, who turned, started to extend a hand, and was not acknowledged and stopped 3 feet from Ethan. You were leaving, she said. It was not a question. I was. She studied him for one moment. Her eyes were a dark, unremarkable gray, the kind of color that turns out to be the most memorable thing in a room. Were you going to say goodbye? To who? Something moved in her expression, not a smile. Exactly. The precursor to one. Fair point, she said. She extended her hand. Not to shake, exactly, she turned it slightly, as if offering rather than requesting. Without quite deciding to, Ethan took it. "Walk with me," she said. They walked. The effect on the room was immediate and total. It was the kind of shift you feel in your chest before you understand it in your head, a pressure change, a recalibration of something in the atmosphere. People who had spent 40 minutes carefully not looking at Ethan Carter were now looking at him with the focused attention of people updating a database in real time. He saw Ryan Blake's face from across the room. Ryan had gone still in a way Ethan had never seen before, the particular stillness of someone whose model of the world has just been revised without his consent. Victoria led him to the outer edge of the terrace, away from the crowd, where the city spread out below them and the sound of the party became background. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server without looking at it. "You're wondering," she said. "Several things," he said. "Ask the most important one." Ethan looked at the water below them. A pause that was not hesitation, just the habit of someone who had learned to say the right thing rather than the first thing. "How do you know my name?" They did not speak for long that night, 20 minutes, perhaps, before the logistics of the event required Victoria to move through the room and perform the minimal obligations that brought her there. But 20 minutes was enough. She had handed him a card before she left. White, matte, the Hale Group logo, a number, and nothing else. "Tomorrow," she'd said. "If you have questions." She had walked away and been absorbed into the room with the same efficiency with which she'd materialized. Ethan had stood at the railing and finished his water. He'd left shortly after, alone, in the same unremarkable way he'd arrived. The difference was that the room had watched him go. By the next morning, the story was circulating through Helix Capital with the speed that only gossip about money can achieve. Ethan arrived at 7:12 to find 3 emails already waiting from people who had never emailed him voluntarily. His manager, Douglas Fenn, a careful, political man who had spent 15 years not taking unnecessary risks, stopped by his desk at 8:30, which had never happened before. "Good event last night?" Douglas asked. His tone was calibrated to suggest that he was asking as a friend, which he was not. "Fine," Ethan said. "You know Victoria Hale personally?" "We've spoken." A pause. Douglas processed this, visibly. I didn't realize you had that kind of network." Ethan said nothing. He had learned, over many years, that saying nothing was often the most informative thing a person could say. Ryan Blake did not come to Ethan's desk that morning. This absence was louder than his presence. By midday, the calls were shifting. People who handled Ethan's requests, with the low-grade negligence of people who have decided a task is beneath them, were suddenly responsive. A request he'd filed 6 weeks ago for access to the Bloomberg Terminal's extended data package appeared in his inbox as approved. The woman in facilities who had been promising him a replacement desk chair since February stopped by with a new one on a dolly. It was absurd. He knew it was absurd. The situation had changed nothing about who he was, what he knew, or what he'd contributed. The number he'd found in column F was still the same number. The meridian analysis was still the same analysis. Nothing was different except that a room full of people had watched a billionaire walk toward him rather than away from him, and so they were updating their calculations. He thought about what Atlas One had written once, about institutional behavior. The herd doesn't think. It notices direction and follows. The only question is whether the person at the front knows where they're going. He stared at his screen. He picked up his phone and opened the forum. He typed, "Something unexpected happened last night. I'm not sure what to make of it." The response came in 11 minutes. "Tell me." He called the number on the card the following evening from the parking lot of Sophie's school while he waited for her choir practice to end. The lot was half empty. Someone had left a grocery cart in the middle of it, and it moved slowly in the wind. She answered on the second ring. "I have questions," he said. "I know." A pause. "Come to the office Thursday morning. 8 o'clock. Tell Douglas I've requested a meeting." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not actually what I want to ask," he said. Another pause, this one with a different quality. Then ask what you want to ask, she said. He watched the grocery cart drift toward the curb. It came to rest against it gently, with the patience of something that had learned to wait. Atlas 1, he said. The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 seconds. He counted. Yes, she said. He had known. He had known. In the way you know something you've been not quite looking at for a long time. The shape of it was familiar. The rhythm. The way she said things, but knowing and hearing confirmed were different categories. 8 months, he said. 8 months and 11 days. You knew who I was the whole time. I knew your name and your employer after the 3rd week. Before that, no. And after I found out, she stopped, started again. I kept coming back because of what you said, not because of what I knew about you. I want to be clear about that. Sophie emerged from the school entrance with 2 friends, backpack half-zipped, laughing at something. Ethan watched her for a moment. He thought about what it meant to be known without being seen. The forum had been a kind of proof of concept, an argument, run live over 8 months, that who you were when stripped of all the visible markers still amounted to something worth returning to. He had not realized he'd needed that argument until it had already been made. The difficulty was knowing what to do with the result. Why the gala? He said again. There were other ways. There were, she agreed. But you were walking out the door. I didn't have time for the other ways. He processed this. You took a significant action in a public setting based on an impulse, he said. It wasn't an impulse. Based on a rapid decision. Is that how you normally operate? A pause. Longer than her usual ones. No, she said. It's not. Sophie had spotted him through the windshield and was waving with her whole arm in the particular extravagant way of 9-year-olds. Thursday, he said. He put the phone in his pocket and got out of the car. The meeting at Helix Capital happened before Thursday. Douglas called him into the glass-walled conference room on Wednesday afternoon, the one on the corner, the good one, the one usually reserved for clients. Ryan was already there. So was Parker Webb, who ran business development and had the particular energy of someone who has recently scented an opportunity. Sit down, Ethan. Douglas's tone was careful, the tone of a man who has rehearsed the register he wants to hit. We've been thinking about how to best utilize your relationship with Victoria Hale. Ethan sat down. He said nothing. The Hale Group has never worked with a Miami-based firm, Parker said. He had a tendency to state facts as if they were insights. That's a significant opportunity. If you were to facilitate a conversation, a formal introduction, a preliminary meeting, and it led somewhere, that would be, he spread his hands. Significant, Douglas offered. We're talking about a dedicated role, Ryan said. He was leaning back in his chair with the posture of someone who has already won and is waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Managing director level. Compensation package that would he paused for effect. Solve several of your personal challenges, let's say. Ethan looked at Ryan. Ryan met his eyes steadily, and for a moment the practiced ease slipped just slightly, revealing something underneath it, not malice. Exactly. More like the specific hunger of someone who has just realized that another person holds a key they want. You'd be doing the firm a favor, Douglas said, and we'd be taking care of you. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about the 3 conversations he'd had with Douglas over the past 2 years, requesting resources that never materialized. He thought about the analysis he'd filed in March, which had saved the firm an estimated $4 million, and the email he'd received in response. Thanks for flagging. He thought about the chair that had taken 6 weeks to arrive and materialized in 24 hours once a certain variable changed. He thought about what Thursday held. I appreciate the offer, he said. But, Douglas said, but I won't be using my relationship with Victoria Hale to broker a deal for the firm. The room went quiet in a specific way, the way rooms go quiet when something has been said that everyone understands but no one expected. Ryan's posture shifted slightly. Ethan, think about what you're saying. I've thought about it. You have 3 kids. You have Ryan stopped himself just short of whatever he was about to say, which Ethan suspected was something about the apartment in Brickell. I know what I have, Ethan said. He stood up. I'll be in Thursday morning, he said to Douglas. I have a meeting. That's a separate matter. He picked up his phone from the table. I'll let you know how it affects my schedule. He left the conference room. The walk from the conference room to his desk was 40 feet through open office space, and he was aware of every foot of it. Not with shame, something different. The particular clarity that comes when you've finally said something you've been not saying for a long time. He sat down. He opened his laptop. He looked at the screen for a moment without processing what was on it. He had just declined a managing director title. He had just declined a compensation package that, by Ryan's implication, would have ended the particular arithmetic of his monthly budget. The calculations he did at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings, the spreadsheet he kept not for sentiment but for survival. He had declined something that would have made the couch into an actual bed and the parking structure outside Lily's window into a different window entirely. He understood the decision he'd made. He did not romanticize it. There was a man Ethan had known in college, a finance professor named Dr. Hammond, who had said something in a lecture that Ethan had never forgotten. Not because it was original, but because of the timing. Ethan had been 22 and still young enough to believe that doing the right thing and being rewarded for it were connected events rather than separate ones. Dr. Hammond had said, "The market prices information, not virtue. If you're going to have principles, you'd better be prepared to carry the cost of them yourself, because the market is not going to help you." Ethan had written it down. He still had the notebook somewhere. He pulled up the Meridian audit document, the audit of the audit, and went back to work, column by column. The numbers didn't care about the last 20 minutes. They had their own logic, and working within that logic was, right now, the closest thing to solid ground he had. What followed was not dramatic. It was something worse than dramatic. It was quiet and methodical and thorough. Ryan moved quickly. By Friday morning, Ethan had been removed from the Meridian project, a strategic reallocation, according to the brief email from Douglas, which contained no other explanation. His calendar invites to the weekly risk committee were quietly discontinued. A junior analyst named Brentley was assigned to cover accounts that had technically been Ethan's for 2 years. The message was not complicated. It did not need to be. He arrived at the office each morning at 7:12. He sat at his desk. His inbox, which had briefly and artificially swelled, returned to its normal, modest volume and then contracted further. By the second week, he was working on a project that amounted to an audit of an audit important in theory, invisible in practice. The kind of work given to someone who is being maintained rather than developed. He paid Marcus, the babysitter, from his checking account and noted the balance afterward. The thing about being professionally sidelined that no one tells you is how much energy it takes to maintain your own self-assessment against the constant, low-grade message being sent by the institution. Every unresponded to email, every meeting from which you've been removed, every time a colleague who used to stop by your desk finds somewhere else to be, they accumulate not as a single event, but as a pattern. And patterns have a way of asking questions you have to keep answering. Maybe they're right. Maybe the value you believed you had was something you constructed. Maybe column F and column H don't matter as much as you thought. Ethan answered these questions the way he answered most things, by looking at the evidence. The evidence was clear. The value was real. The column was real. The problem was not his work. The problem was a system that had decided his work was worth less because he'd declined to be used. He held on to the distinction. It was the most important thing he held on to. He did not contact Victoria. He had thought about it. In the evenings, after the children were asleep and the apartment was quiet, he'd sit on the couch that was still not unfolded and look at the card on the coffee table. He thought about Thursday's meeting, about what she'd said, about the offer that was separate from the other thing. He did not call. It wasn't principle, exactly. Or, it wasn't only principle. It was something more like instinct, the sense that if he reached out now, from this position, he couldn't trust his own motivations clearly enough to know whether he was reaching out for the right reasons. He needed to be able to look at himself in whatever mirror was available and know that he wasn't moving towards something because he was running from something else. So he waited. He worked. He got the children to school. He answered Owen's volcano questions and listened to Sophie's story chapters and let Lily rearrange his hair at 8:15 every evening. He made dinner. He did the math on Sunday nights. He kept the window open because October was starting to make Miami tolerable. He wrote to Atlas One instead. He had thought about it. In the evenings, after the children were asleep and the apartment was quiet, he'd sit on the couch that was still not unfolded and look at the card on the coffee table. He thought about Thursday's meeting, about what she'd said, about the offer that was separate from the other thing. He did not call. It wasn't principle, exactly. Or it wasn't only principle. It was something more like instinct, the sense that if he reached out now, from this position, he couldn't trust his own motivations clearly enough to know whether he was reaching out for the right reasons. He wrote to Atlas One instead. "I made a decision that has cost me something," he wrote. "I know it was the right decision, but knowing something is right doesn't make the cost easier to absorb." The response came at 1:17 a.m. No, it doesn't. That's what makes it real instead of hypothetical. Most people who congratulate themselves on their principles have never had them tested against something they actually needed. He read this several times. Then, "What did it cost you?" He told the truth. There was a long pause, longer than usual. Then, "I see." Nothing else that night. He fell asleep on the couch with the laptop open. At home, the children were the counterweight. Owen had recently become obsessed with a library book about volcanoes and required a nightly briefing on whatever eruption he'd read about that day. Lily had decided that Ethan's hair was a project that needed ongoing attention and would spend 15 minutes before bedtime arranging it into configurations she found aesthetically satisfying. Sophie was writing a story, a long one, apparently, with a cast of characters she'd been developing for 3 months, and sometimes she read him pages from it in the kitchen after dinner, her voice serious and considered, pausing at the end of each page to gauge his reaction. He was a good listener. He always had been. It was his least heralded skill, and possibly his most useful one. One night, Sophie looked up from the page and said, without preamble, "Dad, do you like your job?" He looked at her. She waited with the patience of a 9-year-old who has already decided she'd like a real answer. "Parts of it," he said. "Which parts?" He thought about column F and column H. He thought about the late nights building models, the elegance of a risk framework that held up under stress. He thought about 8 months of conversation with someone who thought at the same speed he did. "The part where I figure things out," he said. "When something's wrong and I'm the one who finds it." Sophie considered this. "Is the rest of it bad?" "The rest of it is—" He paused. "Something I've been patient about for a long time." She nodded, as if this explained something she'd been wondering about. The formal meeting between Helix Capital and the Hale Group was scheduled for the 3rd Thursday of August. Ethan knew about it because he'd been excluded from the preparation, which meant that Ryan had managed, in the week since the conference room conversation, to construct an alternative architecture, one in which Ethan's presumed relationship with Victoria was somehow leveraged without Ethan's involvement, presumably by reaching out through other channels, making the case that the firm's interest in working with the Hale Group was genuine and substantial. He found out about the meeting from Brentley, the junior analyst, who mentioned it while asking Ethan where to find a particular data reference information that would have been obvious to anyone who'd been working the account for more than 6 weeks. Ethan told him where to find it. He did not attend the meeting. He was not invited. He was at his desk at 10:15 that Thursday morning, working on the audit of the audit, when the sound of the building changed. Not dramatically, more like a pressure shift, a reorientation. The way air moves differently when a door opens somewhere you can't see. At 10:47, Douglas Fenn walked to Ethan's desk. His face had an expression Ethan had not seen on it before, not quite alarm, not quite contrition, but somewhere in the territory of both. "She's asking for you," Douglas said. "Who is?" Douglas's jaw moved slightly. "Victoria Hale," he said. "The conference room on the corner, the good one, the one they'd put Ethan in a month ago to offer him a transaction, was full." He recognized the Helix partners. He recognized Parker Webb. Ryan was there, positioned near Douglas, with the posture of someone who had prepared extensively for something and is now watching that preparation become irrelevant. Victoria was at the far end of the table. She was wearing a white jacket and no jewelry, which Ethan suspected was a choice rather than an oversight. She looked at him when he entered and gave him a small nod, the greeting of someone who had been waiting. Not for long, but with the specific patience of someone who knew they would not have to wait much longer. "Mr. Carter," she said, "thank you for joining us." "Of course," he said. He sat down in the empty chair across from her, which was the only empty chair in the room, as if it had been reserved. Victoria looked around the table with the calm attention of someone who has no interest in performing patience and therefore doesn't need to. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "I've spent the past several weeks reviewing Helix Capital's recent output. I've had the opportunity to trace particular pieces of work to their origins." A pause. "Several items of significant value to this firm originated with one person who was not credited for them. I've also learned that when that person declined to be used as a transactional instrument, he was systematically marginalized." The room was very quiet. Parker Webb appeared to be looking at the middle distance with deep interest in nothing. Ryan Blake's hands were flat on the table in front of him. "Still, I'd like to ask a question," Victoria said, "and I'd like a direct answer from the room. Not from lawyers, not from PR language, from the people at this table." She let the silence hold for a moment. "Is this how this firm operates? Or was this an anomaly?" No one spoke. Victoria nodded, as if this confirmed something. "The Hale Group will not be entering into a partnership with Helix Capital," she said. "I want to be clear that this is not a negotiating position. It is a decision based on what I've observed of the firm's culture, specifically its relationship to competence and integrity." She looked at Ryan Blake for one moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the mild, measuring regard of someone closing a ledger. Then she stood. "Ethan," she said, "walk with me." He walked with her. The elevator down was silent. The lobby was full of afternoon light. Outside, the Miami heat was direct and honest about what it was. She stopped on the sidewalk. "I should have called," he said. "You should have," she said. "But I understood why you didn't." She looked at him. "You were trying to make sure your reasons were clean, were they?" He thought about it honestly. "I think so," he said. By the end, she looked at him for a moment longer. "There's an offer on the table," she said. "The same one from Thursday in August. It hasn't changed. The Hale Group is establishing an independent advisory structure, a small team, working on the frameworks that matter to both of us. The things we've been talking about for 8 months. She paused. "I want you to lead it." The city moved around them. A truck changed lanes on Brickell Avenue. Someone walked past with a dog that was moving too quickly for a hot afternoon. "I have 3 children," he said. "I know. The logistics are manageable," she said. "We'll make them manageable." That's not a gift. That's just what reasonable structures look like when people in them matter. He looked at the sidewalk. Then at the street. Then at her. "What does the role actually involve?" he said. And for the first time, something fully relaxed in Victoria Hale's expression, not a smile, so much as the absence of holding back one. "Let's get coffee," she said. "I'll tell you all of it." He gave his notice on a Friday. Douglas accepted it with the careful neutrality of a man who knows an argument would make things worse. Ryan was not in the office that day. The desk, the one with the new chair, was easy to clear. He'd never accumulated much. A framed photo of the 3 kids, a reference book, a coffee mug with a chip in the handle that he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. The mug he threw away. Everything else fit in one bag. He took the elevator down alone. The building's lobby was full of Friday afternoon motion people moving toward their weekends, toward something they'd been waiting for all week. He moved through it with his bag and his jacket folded over his arm. In the parking structure, he sat in his car for a moment before starting it. Not from hesitation, just to let the quiet be quiet for a moment. He thought about the past 8 months, the conversations, the arguments, the late-night messages that had been the most honest discourse he'd had in years. He thought about 8 months of being understood by someone he couldn't see. He started the car. The new office was on the 15th floor of a building in the Design District, which was a Miami neighborhood that had decided it was interested in aesthetics. The space was not large 12 people, eventually, in a room with good light and no glass walls for anyone to look through. Ethan's office, if you could call it that, was a corner of the main room with a standing desk and a window that faced west, which meant the afternoon light came in at a useful angle. The work itself was the thing he hadn't quite let himself anticipate. Not the access, not the resources, though both were real, but the quality of the problems. The Hale Group's advisory structure was concerned with the kind of questions that had been in the background of every conversation he'd had with Atlas One. How capital allocation at scale produces systemic distortions, how institutional incentives misalign with declared values, how to build frameworks that hold up not just mathematically but in the rooms where decisions actually get made, by the people who actually make them. These were not abstract questions. They had consequences, and working on them, Ethan discovered, felt different than any work he'd done before, not in the way that people describe passion projects, with the language of joy or calling. It felt different the way an accurate map feels different from an inaccurate one. The territory was the same, but now he could move through it without constantly checking whether the road he was on was real. He had 4 meetings scheduled his first day. All of them were about things that mattered. He called Marcus the babysitter that evening and offered him a guaranteed weekly rate, predictable hours. No more last-minute calls. Marcus said yes. Ethan wrote the amount in his budget and did the math. The math worked. He sat at the kitchen table afterward with a cup of coffee he actually let cool before he drank it, a small luxury of unhurried time, and thought about the past year. The gala, the rooftop, and the way the city had looked from up there, someone else's dream spread out below. The conference room. The couch he still hadn't unfolded. Next week, he was signing a lease on a 2-bedroom in a building with an actual second bedroom. Sophie would have her own room for the first time. Owen and Lily would share, which Owen was philosophically opposed to, and Lily was entirely enthused about. The building had a small courtyard where Gerald the dinosaur could have outdoor adventures. He was not naive about what had happened. He understood the architecture of it, the luck of the forum, the accident of Atlas One, the chain of events that required Victoria Hale to have been in that particular place on that particular night and to have made a particular decision in the narrow window before an elevator closed. A different night, a different angle, and he might still be sitting on the same couch in the same apartment, running the same numbers on Sunday evenings, getting better and better at work that no one was watching. But he'd also made choices. He had declined to be used. He had told the truth in the conference room when the truth was expensive. He had waited through the weeks of quiet professional punishment without becoming something he wasn't. These were not things that had been done to him. They were things he had done. He thought about what Sophie had said. The story doesn't skip the scared part. It stays there for a while. Good writing for a 9-year-old. Good writing for anyone, actually. The afternoons in October were softer than September. Miami's summer didn't end so much as relent, the heat still present but less insistent, the light starting to understand that it could afford to be gentler. On a Saturday in the middle of the month, Ethan took his 3 children to the park near the water. Sophie brought her notebook. Owen brought a library book about deep-sea geology that had replaced the volcano book with the seamless enthusiasm of someone whose interests evolved faster than his library card could keep up. Lily brought a plastic dinosaur she called Gerald and would not be separated from under any circumstances. When asked where Gerald had come from, Lily always said from before, which was the most philosophically ambitious explanation a 4-year-old had ever offered him. They stayed for 2 hours. Lily fell asleep on a blanket in the shade, one arm thrown out to the side, Gerald still gripped in the other hand with the unconscious intensity of the very young. Owen read to Sophie, who was only half listening but nodded periodically in a way that satisfied him. Ethan sat on the bench at the edge of the grass and watched them and did not look at his phone. He had spent a great deal of time, over the past several years, looking at his phone in situations that deserved more than a phone. Not from negligence, from habit, from the pressure of feeling perpetually behind on something. From the way modern work had arranged itself to feel like an emergency that was always either ongoing or about to arrive. He had gotten good at being present physically while being elsewhere mentally. He was working on unlearning that. His phone rang once. He looked at the name Victoria and silenced the ringer and set it face down on the bench beside him. She would understand. They had built, in the past 2 months, a working relationship that contained enough trust to allow for a phone call that could wait 2 hours. This was not small. Trust that could wait was harder to build than trust that could not. He would call back later. The water was visible from the bench, the bay, flat and glinting in the afternoon. The container ships moving slowly across the horizon, as they always did, enormous and unhurried and indifferent to the scale of human difficulty. He had watched those ships from various vantage points over the years. From the rooftop of the Meridian Tower with a glass of water he wasn't going to finish. From the window of an office where he'd been deliberately unmade. From this bench, which was an ordinary bench in a public park, with 3 children nearby who were his and whom he was, for the first time in a long time, simply watching. Sophie looked up from whatever she'd been writing. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." In my story, she looked at her notebook, then back at him. The main character is trying to decide whether to stay somewhere bad because it's familiar or go somewhere better that's scary. What does she decide? Sophie considered this as if she genuinely didn't know yet, though Ethan suspected she'd known since she started the sentence. "She goes," she said finally. "But the story doesn't skip the scared part. It stays there for a while." "That's the right call," Ethan said. Sophie looked at him with the measuring regard of a 9-year-old who is taking notes for purposes she will only reveal later. "You'd know," she said. She went back to her notebook. The pen moved quickly across the page in the specific way that meant she was getting something down before it could escape. Ethan watched her write. He thought about what it meant to have made it through something without becoming a different person on the other side, or rather, without becoming a smaller version of yourself. The kind of smaller that happens when you make enough compromises in the wrong direction that you can no longer quite remember what you were before you started making them. He had come close. The weeks of deliberate marginalization at Helix Capital had been designed, whether consciously or not, to suggest that his way of operating in the world was the problem, rather than the solution. Systems are very good at suggesting this. They have been doing it for a long time. He had not believed it. This, he now understood, was the thing that had mattered most. Not the forum, not Atlas One, not even the rooftop entrance, with its perfect timing. All of those were real, but they'd been able to work because of a prior condition. He had not believed it. He had held, through everything, a clear enough sense of his own reality that the alternative reality being constructed around him had not been able to fully take. He thought about what Victoria had said in the conversation after they'd left the Helix Capital building, walking toward a coffee shop 2 blocks north. The people who are the hardest to manipulate are the ones who've already answered the important questions for themselves. Not perfectly, no one answers them perfectly. But enough. He had asked her, "When did you know that about me?" She had been quiet for a moment, walking beside him. The Miami afternoon doing its usual heavy-handed work with the light. "Probably month 3, she'd said. "When I pushed back hard on your framework for emerging market contagion risk and you didn't adjust your position to match what you thought I wanted to hear. You just explained it again, differently. With more evidence, I thought. This is either someone who is stubborn to a fault or someone who actually knows what they think." She'd paused. "I waited another 5 months to make sure it was the second one." He had thought about this for a while after. It was not a comforting thing. Exactly the idea that your fundamental character was being evaluated over the course of months by someone you didn't know was watching. But it also wasn't uncomfortable in the way it might have been. He hadn't performed anything. Whatever she'd seen in month 3 was the same thing she'd seen in month 8, because it was the only thing there was to see. Lily stirred on the blanket, turned over, and did not wake up. Gerald the dinosaur was held tight in one small fist. Owen was explaining something to himself under his breath, some geological formation that required narration to be fully understood. The sound of it, barely audible, was one of the most ordinary sounds in the world, and Ethan found it so precisely calming that he had to take a moment to absorb it properly. His phone was still face down on the bench. The missed call would keep. The future it represented was not going anywhere. He stayed on the bench until the light changed, until the afternoon started to make its preparations to become evening, the shadows lengthening across the grass with the slow patience of things that have nowhere else to be. Then he gathered his children. Owen protested the interruption to his narration, but came anyway. Lily woke up with the startled calm of someone who has complete confidence in their environment and therefore never wakes anxious. Sophie closed her notebook with the practiced authority of someone protecting work in progress. They walked back to the car, Lily on Ethan's shoulders because she had decided this was preferable to walking. Gerald held aloft like a conquering standard. Owen told them about a type of undersea volcanic vent that supported entire ecosystems without any sunlight whatsoever. Life that had arranged itself entirely around a different kind of energy, entirely adapted to conditions that would be uninhabitable for anything accustomed to the surface. "That's interesting," Ethan said, and meant it. "It's more than interesting," Owen said, with the polite firmness of someone correcting an understatement. "It's evidence that the conditions we think are necessary aren't actually necessary at all." Ethan looked at his son. "You're right," he said. "That is more than interesting." Owen accepted this revision and continued his explanation. Ethan drove home. The apartment was still the Brickell apartment. The move was next week and it looked the same as it always had. The familiar geometry of 3 kids in 2 bedrooms and a couch that served as a bed. But the way it looked had something different in it. Not the space itself. The understanding of it. The knowledge that it had been, without his fully realizing it. The place where he'd held on to himself through the period when everything else was trying to suggest he let go. He made dinner. He answered Owen's follow-up questions about hydrothermal vents. He listened to Lily explain, at length, where Gerald had been during the park visit. Everywhere, apparently, simultaneously. He read 2 pages of Sophie's story at her invitation. She handed him the notebook with the gravity of someone offering a confidence, and told her honestly that the character's decision in Chapter 4 was the correct one, and that the way she'd written the scared part was exactly right. Present, specific, and not rushed. Sophie took the notebook back and added something to the margin. He put them all to bed. He cleaned the kitchen. He went to the couch. He picked up his phone and called Victoria. She answered on the second ring. "How was the park?" she said. "Good," he said. "My son explained hydrothermal vent ecosystems. Were they relevant to anything?" "They were relevant to several things," he said. A pause that had warmth in it. "The Nakamura Framework Review is scheduled for Monday," she said, shifting registers in the way she did when she'd allowed a moment and was now moving through the door on the other side of it. "I want to walk through your concerns before the team call. Are you free at 7? 7 works, he said. "I'll send the documents tonight." Another pause, briefer. "Good," she said. And there was something in the word, not sentiment, not performance, just the plain acknowledgement that something was good, that it was genuinely, accurately, measurably good. "Good," he said. He put the phone down. He looked at the ceiling of the apartment for a moment. Then he reached out, grabbed the mechanism at the edge of the couch, and unfolded it into a bed. It was more comfortable than it looked. Tomorrow was Sunday. He would do the math. It would work. The measure of a person is not who sees them on their best days. It is who looks for them when no one else is. Ethan Carter had spent a long time being invisible to the wrong people. The right person had been watching for 8 months before she walked across a rooftop and refused to let him walk out the door. He didn't need the room to see him. He needed one person who knew exactly what she was looking at. That, it turned out, was enough.